go, but you will grow. You matter. The disconnect is reflected in the disrespect, but we could change those patterns. In these trying times, be kind to self to ease your mind. It'll help you find your way. We matter. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Truth and reconciliation is watching my son be a human being in this world and having the choice to do what he wants when he wants and not feel the pressure of the oppression that I grew up with and my parents grew up with. My parents and their parents were a part of the residential school system. My generation and my age group is the first that wasn't in the residential school system, and the TRC movement, from my understanding, came out of what happened in residential schools to be exposed for what it really is, cultural genocide, and to hold the church and the government accountable for what happened in the residential school system, which also stems outside of that to all cultural genocide that our First Peoples of this country and many other countries have gone through.
I honestly believe that truth and reconciliation still needs to happen at the very forefront. And what I mean by that is healing needs to take place in a very honest way.
Remember the truth part of truth and reconciliation, that it requires lots of honesty and understanding.
So for the Anishinaabe people, the word truth in the language is debwewin, and the definition of that word is a truth that is rooted in my heart. I like that. I also was told by the elders that were in and around me as I was growing up as a young woman that we are told and guided to live what is called the good life. And the good life is made up of many things. It has what holds us as a people, things that we would call virtues. We call them things like humility, learning to be humble, a deep honesty, learning to be respectful, learning to practice wisdom, which is the application of knowledge, learning to be courageous and true to courage, learning to speak your truth that is rooted in your heart. All of these things held together and guided by love.
It's sort of a cheap way of the Canadian government going, we're going to acknowledge that this happened, we're going to quote unquote apologize that this happened, even though the apology is nothing that clears it up for a lot of residential school survivors.
What is it that we really are asking? Because truth and reconciliation doesn't really explain what it means. You know, it doesn't to me. To me, it's a government way of, I would say, putting things in a box again in regards to our history. I really feel since the truth and reconciliation has come out, there's been movement for maybe about a year or two, and it's come very stagnant.
So if we were to look at truth as something that is rooted in our hearts, we are now at a very interesting time. There seems to be like an opening for us, an awareness that's occurred in the consciousness of humanity. And if we really look within and look at that definition of truth, we have an incredible opportunity to step into what I was taught is the sacred circle or the medicine wheel.
The actual word reconciliation is about recognizing and apologizing for your wrongdoings and then taking action to make up for those wrongdoings to the wronged party in whatever way that wrong party would like you to make up for it. Canada right now is not doing that to the fullest extent that it can.
With the story of reconciliation, we are currently trying to resolve the trauma that has happened to residential school survivors. This trauma that carries out through a family. So it goes from the survivor to their children, to their grandchildren, to their great-grandchildren, and it continues on. I think there's like something like 6 or 7 generations that it's been going on for. 1996, that the last residential school was closed down. That was just over 20 years ago. That was 22 years ago. A lot of people weren't aware that it was that recent. Numerous residential schools have been taken down, but the stories that went along with them are still there, and you can still learn about them. Basically, the mandate of a residential school was to take the Indian out of the child. It was to basically colonize the child and Christianize them in order for them to be a part of mainstream society.
Truth and reconciliation mean to me the healing of the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
Truth and reconciliation means all of the work that's needed to be done to build and nurture relationships with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in our community. Given the past experience of Indigenous peoples with settler society, there is much learning that needs to be done. We need to become aware of the experience of residential schools, of treaty negotiations, of the banning of Indigenous culture, and of the broken promises, and what they've meant to First Nations people.
There's a lot of healing that needs to happen amongst my people, Indigenous people, along with, mainstream society. It's not about holding shame that doesn't belong to you. Far too much we do that, and it's not ours to carry. So.
Reconciliation is creating space for healing to take place.
I feel it means, coming from a place of healing, moving forward together from a place of understanding, coming together as one. We have a word for that, Namwayut, which is we are all one. And to do that, I think a lot of the reconciliation needs to come from within.
Truth and reconciliation really has to start with yourself. If you can't be truthful with yourself, you're going to go nowhere.
So you have a choice to say yes or no to reconciliation. And unfortunately, there are still a lot of Canadians who are either uneducated about residential schools or refuse to reconcile with First Nations communities and their peers.
Teach each other. I think that's key in being open to those teachings on both sides. This isn't just an Indigenous problem, this is a whole Canada issue that needs to be addressed. Why can't mainstream society adopt a lot of these cultural ways and cultural beliefs to move forward together as one?
I'm really hoping that moving forward, action can be taken to improve the quality and nurturing the growth of the peoples of Canada by way of looking at absolving the Indian Act.
Truth and reconciliation means to me Indigenous self-determination and Indigenous self-government.
Truth and reconciliation to me means being responsive to the relational needs and understandings of First Nations people. I think it's important to understand the complexities and the harms of colonization, some of the ways that it's impacted like individual Aboriginal people, but also their families and communities in terms of education, basic human rights like clean water, things like that, the Murdered and Missing Women Inquiry, the overrepresentation of kids in child welfare and in jails and things like that.
My one and only son doesn't know who he is due to the history that I'm sharing right now, and our relationship is estranged, and that as a mom really hurts.
I lost ties with the Native side of my family. There's still many relations that I haven't been able to achieve reconciliation with. I don't know what to say about that.
Truth and reconciliation to me means healing by creating mutual understanding and respect. This will hopefully create a positive ripple effect for individuals, communities, and future generations.
It is our responsibility to be a witness so that the truth can be heard and acknowledged.
We often listen to reply, and we don't listen to understand. Communication is huge, and I feel just by listening to understand can go a long ways.
The number one respect, the highest respect, is listening and understanding that person. And I truly believe that. If we are not heard as First Nation people, even from our own people, then what does truth and reconciliation mean? I respect that people do want the history to be taught to our children. I have 2 grandboys. They do know about my history. I went to residential school, and I'm part of the 60 Scoop, as well as all my grandparents. So I carried the weight on my shoulders, their history, and I did my best. To this day, I still do my best not to pass that on to my grandboys. They're very strong believers in knowing who they are, and that's what I think where truth and reconciliation needs to happen, is knowing that our children, our grandchildren, know who they are.
So something that I've done for myself to help my community and my nation reconcile is to have a strong cultural connection and grounding in order to revitalize culture and carry it on for future generations. With reconciliation at a personal level, you could definitely do your best to educate yourself. Racism is something that's learned. It's not something that you're born with, like your DNA, your eyes, your hair. It's not something that you're born with. Some people are born into a family where racism is really accepted and is taught every day. If racism is something that's learned, it's something that can be stopped.
I do work with people that are very vulnerable, and I still see that the truth and reconciliation does not apply to them at all. There's still a lot of people displaced. So I think we need to look at our people that are still lost.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has made 94 recommendations to the Canadian government about what Indigenous peoples want and need to see for that relationship between municipal, provincial, and federal Canada and its citizens to be repaired. It's still something we're waiting to see, because today we have easy more than 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Over 50% of the children in foster care across Canada are Indigenous. We have high levels of suicide, poverty, incarceration, homicide, domestic violence, violence in general, and those statistics tell me that Canada and its citizens have a long way to go on the path to reconciliation. And part of that is honoring the truth of those statistics.
When I was a young woman, when I first heard about the teachings of the Sacred Circle, the Medicine Wheel, I was told that every human being in the world belonged on the Sacred Circle. I remember how it impacted me and how it made me feel a sense of belonging that I'd never felt before. And I had the realization that we are all on a journey of humanity. So I've been taught that our elders walk with us, stand with us. They're always with us. They're always whispering gently to guide us. They might be even pushing us a little bit very gently to come together, to walk on this path of truth and reconciliation. So if we look into our roots of our languages and dig into the truer definitions of what truth means to us, and we join hands, we can walk forward with strength on an incredible journey towards a life that's united, peaceful, and held together with love. All my relations.
When we broke our coppers at the legislature building and the parliament building here in Canada, we broke a spell of false dominance and control. The true custodians of Mother Earth, we the tribal people have standing. And it is up to the people to uphold justice. That means that the law enforcement and the military first responsibility is to protect the tribal people of this land. And we want to remind you, American and Canadian citizens, that you are still our guests here, and we are still your hosts.